All right, you're good to go, Louis.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Louis Bossing, and I'm an attorney at the Bazalon Center for Mental Health Law. I am a bald, bearded, middle-aged man sitting in my office in Washington, D.C. We are very happy to co-present today's event in Olmstead's Promise, Ending Police Violence Against Black Disability Communities with Community-Based Services, with our friends from the Legal Defense Fund. We are very grateful to all of today's inspiring speakers, who you'll hear from in just a minute. The Bazalon Center advocates for the civil rights, full inclusion, and equality of people with mental disabilities. Those of us here follow in the footsteps of those advocates who have worked tirelessly to ensure that people with mental disabilities can live in their own homes and communities and enjoy all the opportunities for community living that everyone else does. This year and every year, we celebrate the Supreme Court's decision in Olmstead versus LC, which held that unnecessary segregation is discrimination under the Americans with Disabilities Act. Today's event is part of that celebration. Among other things, we celebrate Lois Curtis, the LC in Olmstead versus LC, who was a Black woman with lived experience with mental disabilities who fought for and won her civil rights. Today, we are also proud to lift up the report we co-authored with the Legal Defense Fund and released on July 6th, Advancing an Alternative to Police, Community-Based Services for Black People with Mental Illness. As the report makes clear, the remedies needed to address unnecessary segregation under Olmstead, including a robust, community-based mental health service system that can timely respond when people need help, all the more important for Black people with lived experience with mental illness who live at the intersection of race and disability discrimination and who have experienced significant harm at the hands of police responding to their calls for help. We encourage you to participate in today's discussion by sharing your questions for our panelists in the chat. I am very honored to introduce our next speaker. I have been in many Zooms with Lisa over the years, and I'm very happy that she can be with us in this one. Please welcome Lisa Kylar Barrett, Director of Policy for the Legal Defense Fund.
Thank you so much, Louis. It is indeed wonderful to be here with you, and good afternoon to all. As Louis said, my name is Lisa Kylar Barrett. I'm the Director of Policy and the Director of the DC office at the Legal Defense Fund, also known as LDF. We are the nation's oldest civil rights legal organization, founded in 1940 by Thurgood Marshall. And I just want to add our official welcome to this important discussion and say how thrilled we are to co-host this event with the Bazalon Center. LDF's work to address police violence and misconduct dates back to its inception, with our founder, Thurgood Marshall, and other members of the LDF team litigating seminal cases, challenging the brutal and often unconstitutional actions of law enforcement officers, as well as the discriminatory practices of various law enforcement agencies. Our current work on these issues is centered through our Justice and Public Safety Project, which uses litigation, policy advocacy, research, community organizing, and strategic communications to, one, ensure accountability for police brutality and misconduct, but also to promote policing and public safety practices that eliminate the pernicious influence of racial and other biases. And on a broader scale, to support a new paradigm of public safety that ends police violence and drastically reduces the presence of armed law enforcement in communities of color. And so today's discussion is truly a critical aspect of those efforts. We have all seen repeated accounts of people, and particularly Black people, experiencing mental illness, being mistreated, and often killed due to encounters with law enforcement officers who are ill-equipped and often ill-equipped to appropriately assess and address the needs of the individual, and also to address the lack of community-based services. We hope that the report, which Lewis just mentioned, that we co-authored with Bazalon, and today's discussion will help to advance policies and practices which replace the current practice of a law enforcement response, and instead provide a framework for the much needed services and supports. I'm going to stay as long as I can because I want to hear all of this discussion, but unfortunately I do have another meeting at 1, and so I'm unable to stay for the entire event. But I do want to take a moment now to say a huge thank you to our panelists and participants, Mr. Vassal, Jalen, Victor, and Estelle, for being willing to join the conversation today to share the experiences of their families and loved ones. I also want to thank Lewis and the entire Bazalon team for partnering with us on this important effort. And lastly, but definitely not least, I want to shout out Puneet Chima from the LDF team, who you will hear from momentarily. Puneet leads and manages our Justice and Public Safety project and is extremely passionate about promoting a new paradigm for public safety. She's been the lead from our team on these efforts. And so I want to publicly thank her for all of her efforts and leadership. I'm really just looking forward to a meaningful conversation and to working together to make these much needed shifts to end violence against people with mental disabilities. And so Puneet, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Lisa. I'm thrilled to introduce an incredibly inspiring group of advocates and experts who are joining us today for this important conversation about the harms of police responses to people with mental illness, especially when they are Black, and the community-based services that need to be provided to avoid police involvement in involuntary hospitalization. Jalen Radziminski is a Black and Japanese activist whose work is dedicated to advocating for racial equity, voter rights, and disability justice for BIPOC communities. At the national level, Jalen works at the Bazalon Center for Mental Health Law and uplifts peer voices, testimonies, programs, and agendas through the media, grassroots campaigns, policy advocacy, and by connecting legal advocacy support. They also work to increase Black and disability voter turnout, first through the American Association of People with Disabilities Fannie Lou Hamer program, and now as an AAPD Rev Up Advisory Board member. At the local level, Radziminski is the founder of Count Us In, the first Indiana-based nonpartisan nonprofit meant to increase and diversify civic engagement and voter turnout, and serves as a commissioner for Indiana Disability Rights Protection and Advocacy Services. Victor Dempsey is a community organizer at LDF, where he builds and leads community organizing initiatives that transform public safety systems in partnership with families and communities impacted by police violence. Before joining LDF, Victor was a community organizer for the Legal Aid Society's Community Justice Unit. Victor's passion for advocacy and activism is inspired by the tragic police killing of Delron Small, Victor's older brother, who was shot by an off-duty NYPD officer in Brooklyn, New York on July 4th, 2016. Victor organizes to promote accountability for police violence and works closely with impacted families and system-involved Black and Brown youth. He raises awareness about police violence, including his brother's case, while also shining a light on the underlying social injustices plaguing this country that lead to police involvement. Victor's advocacy extends beyond police brutality, supporting efforts to end racially biased gang enforcement practices in New York City and connecting families impacted by police brutality through Families Are the Front Lines, a support and advocacy group he co-founded in 2020. Through his activism, Victor met Eric Vassal, a Jamaican-born Crown Heights resident, a father of 10, and a grandfather to many. We are grateful to speak with Mr. Vassal today, whose son Saeed was stolen from us on April 4th, 2018 by NYPD plainclothes officers in Crown Heights, Brooklyn, New York. Since the loss of his son, Mr. Vassal has advocated against police brutality by standing in solidarity with families nationwide. He has taken a personal interest in addressing the inaccessibility and inadequacy of services for people with mental illness, inspired by his own family's struggle for assistance while living with Saeed's diagnosed mental illness. Through his advocacy, Mr. Vassal realized how important it is to look past the stigmas surrounding mental illness and meet those living with mental illness where they are. He is an advocate not only for Saeed, but also for the proper response to helping people with mental illness without the loss of life. Mr. Vassal's continued call for the improved treatment of people with mental illness strikes a deep personal chord for him as he continues to grapple with the loss of his son. Estelle Richmond is a nationally recognized expert on behavioral health and children's services and has advocated for mental health services at the local, state, and federal levels. Estelle retired in 2013 as the Senior Advisor to the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development for Health and Human Services Issues, where she also served as the Chief Operating Officer and Acting Deputy Secretary. Prior to her work at HUD, Estelle served as the Secretary of the Pennsylvania Department of Public Welfare for 7 years, appointed by Governor Ed Rendell. In this role, Estelle led initiatives to create community-based services, a behavioral Medicaid agency, and a system of care for people on the autism spectrum. Estelle also worked to close state institutions, integrate systems of care, and advocate for people with disabilities. In addition to the State Department of Public Welfare, Estelle formerly served as the Managing Director and the Director of Social Services for the City of Philadelphia and the City of Philadelphia's Commissioner of Public Health. Estelle continues to serve on several local and national boards, as well as participate in various task forces and other civic activities to push for increased access to mental health services. To kick us off, we know that our current system has devastating consequences. Law enforcement officers are often dispatched when people call for help, for when a loved one with mental illness needs assistance, or when others call emergency services because they think a person with mental illness is acting in a way that they find unusual. Too often, when people with mental illness are Black, these calls for help are deadly or lead to involuntary hospitalization. But we know what the solutions are that need to be implemented. Jalen, I'll start with you. Can you share a bit about what the promise of Olmstead means to you?
Thank you so much, Puneet. And sure, so when I think about Olmstead's promise, I think about the Olmstead decision and the promise of essentially integration that was issued on June 22nd, 1999. And to put it in perspective how recent this decision is, I was just turning 4 years old when organizations like the Bazalon Center helped establish such an important precedent with Lois Curtis. And young millennials and Gen Z like myself, we're the first generations to be born into a promise like this. But however, just in my personal experience, that promise has been threatened to be broken. First for me personally at the age of 12, and it was really shattered in my early 20s. As a 12-year-old, I remember texting the Lifeline hotline in emotional distress while really it was distressed about the potential incarceration of my father. And at the end of the text conversation with the hotline, I remember the hotline gave me a Bible verse and just notified me that the police will be showing up at my door shortly. I begged them not to come, and I was really fortunate to avoid an encounter that time. And I can personally attest that the solutions in the paper that we're going to be talking about today and in this conversation would have prevented me from losing much time and confidence in myself as an early straight A college student. And when I personally experienced a mental health crisis in my early 20s, my college friends called 911. Unknowingly, this caused a typical chain reaction, unfortunately, that many people, especially Black people with mental health struggles face. police response to the emergency room to involuntary and being put into involuntary hospitalization. And as a survivor of mental health institutions and this unfortunate but common chain reaction, I can attest that involuntary institutionalization, coercion, and police response is simply not the answer. Peer-led respites and BIPOC peer-led warm lines and hotlines would have given me a sanctuary to authentically speak on what I was going through without fear of being forced to take medication or that was hurting my well-being at the time or being locked away. And more inclusive model policies, accommodations, and resources would have enabled me to take better care of my health with dignity while balancing being a better student and later in life being a better employee without having to power through without accommodations and without having to suffer in silence with the fear that I would be thrown away, devalued, or segregated from society. So when I think of Olmstead's promise, it's long time past that promise is kept, and the fight for those before me, like Lois Curtis, is honored, not just through the legal system, but through disability justice to fully have an equitable and integrated society. Thank you for that question, Paneet.
Thank you so much, Jalen. And Mr. Vassal, can I turn it to you? Can you tell us a little bit more about your family and your son, Saeed?
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Saeed Vassal's father. He was killed on April 4, 2018. Me and my family came here in 1989 seeking a better life in the United States so our children could grow up with dignity and pride. Saeed attended Wingate High School. After he left Wingate High School, he went to Apex Trade School, where he came out with a degree in welding. And that's where he started to work at the Brooklyn Navy Yard. During the period of time he was working at Brooklyn Navy Yard, one of his friends got killed by the police. And that's where he started to suffer from mental issue. Saeed is a wonderful young man growing up, loved to dance, loved to sing. He was kind to his family, especially his sisters. After his death, it brings a lot of heartaches and pain upon our family that even today, it lingers on in our family.
Thank you so much, Mr. Vassal. And Mr. Vassal, can you talk a little bit about the challenges that you and your family faced when trying to get Saeed the support and services that he needed?
Yes, the first challenges that we face when we went to the city to ask them to look into Saeed's case, the first thing happened to us that they want us to get rid of Saeed from the home. And if we did not get Saeed out of the house, they will come and take our younger kids that were living there, because they say we have a mental person living inside the house, and having a mental person living inside the house, we cannot have young kids living there. So that was the first obstacle that comes in our way. We could not put our son out because we could not put him on the street. And that's where the struggle goes on. I had was to move my children from the house, place them with my son so I could care for Saeed during that time before he was killed.
Jalen or Estelle, did you have any additions about the challenges that you have seen families face when trying to access services?
You know, having heard Mr. Vassal talk before, every time it's like a stab in the heart to know that there's systems that believe that this isn't painful to families and that they want to help their family member. And they need to listen. And they need to offer solutions that will be seen as helpful to the families, not destroying the families, not creating more pain. You know, the sad part is almost all of the major cities and most of our cities do have mental health services. The challenge is, why aren't we making them work? Why are we continuing? Why aren't we continuing to make sure that they are doing the jobs that we are paying them for? We have a lot of tax money going into these services. And, you know, when you hear stories like this, you wonder what we're paying for. There are, in every system, there should be some level of mobile crisis that can go out and respond, that has that capability of having people work with the family. Every system should have some level of going into the home and offering support and help. The key for me, and Jalen, I'm so glad you mentioned it, are peer specialists and peer specialists that look like the people who they're going to be working with. And peer specialists who have had that real live lived experience, that they know the pain of the family and they seek ways to resolve it. Now, you know, you don't create a system overnight, and everybody will say there's enough money, not enough money. Money's a challenge, there's no doubt about it. But money is not an excuse not to be able to provide necessary services. It is not an excuse to continue the abuse of families and people of color in our cities. Olmstead gave us the vision. Now we need to make that vision real. We've been working on this. I respect the fact that you were 5. I was in the middle of my career when Olmstead was passed, and we saw it as, wow, we finally have the law on our side. We finally have ways that we can push this envelope. And then we discovered political will. Elected officials didn't want to take risks. We found state individuals that said they didn't put any money in it, therefore we don't have to do it. We found excuse after excuse. But in that, we also found some real people who wanted to help and who wanted to make a difference. We just don't have enough of them yet. And I know this is a question that will come up again, but I have to just make this point over and over again. When people are in a crisis, the last people you want to call are the police. When we have a medical crisis, we don't call the police. A mental health issue is a medical crisis. We call mental health professionals. We call people who are and who understand crises. We don't call people who've had 2 hours of training at some point in their background.
Jalen, was there something that you wanted to say too?
Thank you. I was just going to say I completely agree with everything Estelle has mentioned, and I really felt what Mr. Vassal said in his fight as Sahid's father to keep him in his home. I vividly remember just from my personal experience as the daughter of parents who fought so hard like him to keep me into the community and really helped me become the advocate that I am today. A lot of the burden falls on our parents along with ourselves. And just to say that when people go through police encounters and coercion and involuntarily being forced to do things, it adds an additional burden not only on the individual, but the families as well that are fighting to get you out of those systems. There's costs that people did not ask for that are placed as a burden on the family. And then as the person who is living with the experience that's carrying these traumas, that's carrying pain, that only quadruples and compounds on the trauma that you are already personally experiencing. It already compounds on the guilt and the weight of trying to figure out how to navigate this very inaccessible world. So I just want to commend Estelle for her fight for children at least being born into the hope of Olmstead's promise, and Mr. Vassal for being one of those incredible fathers that fought for your son. A lot of us go through this, so thank you.
Thank you so much. Mr. Vassal, is there anything more you want to share about the impact that the challenges in accessing services, the impact that that had on your family and you?
Oh, yes. The impact that it have on our family is that during the 10 years that Sahid was sick, we tried so many times to get help for him. The city used to give him a few, stipend and ask him to go to the program. And as soon as he didn't go to the program, they took it all back away from him and just leave us as a family to care for him. We tried to put him into an institute, and they tell us that we cannot make that decision for Sahid because Sahid is an adult. He have to make that decision for himself. And we argue with them saying that, but if he's a mental person, how can he make a decision for himself? Nevertheless, they just put that aside and they just leave him on his own, never give him anything, took away everything. And me and my family had was to support Sahid through his sickness, through his needs, through his wants. He have a son. We had was to, take him over to start to support him. So there was no help. There was no help for Sahid. There was no people from the city that comes to our home to check on him to see if he was living or if he was dead. All the responsibility was on me, my wife, my sons, and my daughter. So it was very frustrating. It was hard to see my son struggle, and the city would not give us any help. And to make matters worse, it was the city that come back and kill my son. So because of that, it brings up pain. My wife cries every day. My daughter is now going through an issue whenever time we think about his brother. So until today, it's still an impact on us. Also, his son is also struggling to see that his dad was killed into a brutal fashion. So it's very hard on us, even at this time. The city failed Sahid, the city failed us. And I would not want to see other people going through mental issue fail as how my family and Sahid was failed.
Thank you so much, Mr. Vassal. And Victor, you've been working closely with Mr. Vassal and his family for years now. Is there anything more you want to share about what Sahid meant to his community and what you've seen with Mr. Vassal and his family?
Yeah, well, I was listening to everybody and I'm sitting there fighting with my screen. I was a little upset about how dark it looks, but I think I could try to hide some of the tears that might come in a little bit. But seriously, I remember responding to the community after Sahid was murdered within hours and before I even knew Pops and met the family. And I remember seeing all of the community of Crown Heights just in the streets. And it was so easy for me to find the Vassal family because the community as a whole was trying to find help for the family. And they brought me right to his doorstep. But I start with that piece because Sahid was actually an intricate member of the Crown Heights community. As we met the family and, unfortunately having to deal with the loss of my brother and trying to navigate, again, government services like victim services, right? Getting access to folks to try to see what went wrong. How do we fight? That's who we were for the Vassal family. But during that time, we started to do some story banking in the community, because while we were on the ground, we just seen everyone crying. This wasn't, unfortunately, I've been to tons of memorials, unfortunately, police are killing folks left and right. But as we started getting those stories from the community, we realized that everyone had a different part of Saheed within themselves. And what I mean is that by that is, like Pops can attest to this as well, he's learned so much about his son outside of the home. Even though he's looking for services to help him with his mental illnesses, the community, the real community of Crown Heights, never seen Saheed as a person with a mental illness, because he was the person literally waking up at 4:45 in the morning, going to the local fruit stand and helping the owner open up shop and roll a baskets of fruit to the front of the store. He was the person that I heard, and this is documented. He was the person I heard that every Tuesday or Wednesday, Pops, I can't remember the date. I think it was every Tuesday or Wednesday, there was an elder woman in 2 blocks away that he would go to her house every week to do her dry cleaning for her. And she would give him cash, and she never had incorrect change. This is a person that we're talking about. And the reason why I think that's equally important is because as a community, as a people, as a whole, even that's not professional, the interpretation of mental illness is even a barrier because of the disconnect between the services not being provided. So in the loss of Saheed, we learned of so many instances that mental illness impacts. We were dealing with police response and how they respond to folks with mental illnesses. We were looking at the ugliness of gentrification of Black and brown communities and how they interpret mental illnesses. Because I want to be clear here, the folks who called 911 to say there was an individual in the community with a weapon in their hand, specifically a gun, didn't know Saheed. Saheed did not have a gun, and I encourage anyone, I hate to do this, and Pops, please tell me to stop. I encourage everyone to go and see the video. I encourage everyone to go watch the footage, because there was nothing there. So when we think about mental illness and the interpretation of mental illness from regular folks, that's a big problem. The access to it and how folks respond specifically to Black and brown communities that are dealing with mental illness, it's a complete disconnect there. But the things that I learned about Saheed through the story bank, and I've seen someone, it was a long process, but believe it or not, that long process only took us roughly 9 days because the community was willing to come speak. The community wanted us to know who Saheed was. And Pops, like, I'm smiling now, not because it was funny, because these were those good memories of building relationships. We couldn't even find a big enough home, church to do this funeral services at, because everyone wanted to be there. And not just for Saheed, but to support the family in their loss, in this tragedy. And I want to make one more, actually, I'm going to wait, but learning about Saheed was really a pleasure because now I have an extended family myself. But understanding what he meant to everyone individually, not just to his father, not just to his mother, not just to his siblings, but those store owners, the elders in the community, the young folks who like to dance with him, the barbershop he used to attend to sweep up and hang out with them. He's truly missed. And when we talk about this mental illness, this is a generational trauma. Like Mr. Vassell said, Saheed was diagnosed for over 10 years because of the failure of the city to acknowledge the services that needed to be provided for him. And I also want to add, Saheed struggled with his mental illness because he's seen one of his childhood friends also murdered right in front of him. So I just encourage and implore folks to understand that mental illness is not one label. It's things that can be addressed in a multitude of ways, but if we don't have the proper access to the services, it's hard to address them, and we're stuck with families like the Vassells to fend for themselves and just show love and compassion the best way they know how.
Victor, I want to ask one more question to both you and Mr. Vassal. Is there anything about the role of media in the incidents, in the shootings of both your brother and of Fahid that you want to touch on, and what you would want media to do differently?
Pops, I don't know if you want to jump in, but
Yes, the first disappointment I had with the media is that maybe half an hour after Saheed was killed, he was now on the television screen. They're showing him acting up. They start to talk about him that he was a homeless person. And, you know, they stated that he pointed things at the police. And to me, those things should have never been said about Saheed during the time when his family were and friends were, you know, going through this grievance. So that was the most upsetting part. Another upsetting part is when the mayor came on and said, well, it was a split decision and the police, you know, they have to act. So even that was a painful thing for us to listen to, knowing to the fact that a young man being killed and the community is, you know, going through it. So the media was one part of the story that we have to talk about, that they disappointed us and the city disappointed us. They didn't come to us to, you know, heal our family. They just talk some bad things about Saheed and show some pictures on the television about him that I believe shouldn't have been said, or these things shouldn't have been done to the family, you know, going through the time of hurt. So the media play a bad part in this situation also.
And you know, I will add to this too, because the media was really the impetus for us to start the story banking. We had to combat a narrative while trying to be there for the family and provide, not even provide anything, just be there for the family in their time of grief and need, in their time of confusion. It was a lot. So for this family to try to internalize that their son was just murdered, and literally, like Pops, well, Mr. Vass was saying, within an hour, half an hour, there was breaking news on every media outlet. And they didn't even have the story. Till this day, Saheed's mother, Lorna Vassal, she cries every day. That's what her, they said he was homeless. When Pops is a father of 10 and the numerous grandkids, and I've been to his house numerous times and I eat a nice cooked, hot Jamaican meal every time I'm there. There's no way anyone in the community would allow the rhetoric of Saheed being homeless to play out. And this is why the community was so forthcoming with the story being emphasized, because we had to combat a narrative. And unfortunately, again, we're seeing the instance where government services essentially are working in a tandem. And I don't want to get too far on the limb here, but I need folks to understand, folks with mental illness are harmed a lot by law enforcement, because law enforcement are not the proper people to respond if they're in a crisis or if they're having an episode or anything of that nature. Which I also want to be clear, this was not the case with Saheed that day. Saheed was actually enjoying his day, hanging out in the barbershop. All he did was cross the street. But the role of media, and I want to be clear, when media is not a race to a story, they treat it like it's a race to the story. It's a race to breaking news. They're not fact checking things in the very beginning stages of an egregious act of this nature. So who are they relying on the information that they're publicizing within that half an hour? Law enforcement, the perpetrators of the crime. So when you get that narrative out there of a homeless man with a mental illness, you're criminalizing a sickness, you're criminalizing an illness, you're weaponizing it, so to speak. And it's really not right. You know, we struggle a lot with getting media to understand that they need to fact check every single thing they put out, especially not just in police brutality cases, in any case in general, because you're painting a picture to the public that's not right. And it's not the truth. And I'm going to be honest, it's not the truth. So, that really played the big role. But again, it was a setback for the family and what they needed to try to get justice for their loved one, of having to combat a false narrative.
Thank you so much. And Victor, you touched on this, and Estelle touched on this earlier as well. So I want to open this up to everyone. A lot of jurisdictions and legislators are turning to crisis intervention training. So a short training for officers to respond to people with mental illness, or co-responder models where law enforcement officers continue to respond to people in crisis or 911 calls when someone thinks they may have mental illness, but with a mental health worker. And studies that we cite in our report show that these programs don't really solve the problem. But I want to hear from all of you, why is it a problem for law enforcement to respond to people in crisis or with mental illness when people call 911 about them? Who wants to go first? Estelle, do you want to go first?
Sure. One of the challenges is that we spend, people that respond to crises and people with mental health have master's degrees, go to college, have lots of experience in dealing with someone with a mental illness and in a crisis. Do we really think that if we give police 10 hours of training that they might or might not practice, that equips them to be able to respond to someone who's having a crisis, or to someone in the neighborhood who thinks they're having a crisis? It doesn't even make sense sometimes that we send someone with so little training to replace people who've had years of training. And in many cases, as it did with Sahid, they respond and they immediately react. They don't talk. They don't wait. They don't wait to see if there's someone with more experience coming in. They're taught to see everything as a risk and a danger to them.
Oh, I think you're muted, Estelle.
Estelle, you're still muted.
Okay, while we figure out our Estelle's sound, Victor, Jalen, Mr. Vassal, do any of you want to add to that?
Okay, yes. Just let's say if a person is mental and if a person is homeless, I believe if a person is mental and a person is homeless, this is where the city should come in and treat those people with dignity and to help them not be homeless and try to get them resources because they are mental issue. But I realized that when a person is homeless and they're in a mental stage, they don't treat them as a human being. And this is where my heart is now, because they should be treated as human beings, not because they are mental and not because they are homeless. Another thing, Sahid was killed within at least 9 seconds when the police, they arrived. Give him no time, they didn't talk to him, they didn't say anything to him, they just called him and as he turned around, they shot him. So if this is the way the city gonna treat people with mental issue and people who are homeless, I see that it is broken and it needs to be fixed.
Thank you so much, Mr. Vassal.
Seems to be that police are in such a hurry. You know, in other situations, they wait for the expertise. You know, all I think that I would like to see the police do is wait for expertise, wait for a mental health professional, wait for someone who understands crises, and not to intervene, to wait, to stand off, or to talk calmly to a person, but not to rush in with guns in a threatening stance, yelling.
Thank you so much, Estelle. Victor, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I do. So, you know, I've been blessed and honored to, in my career, to work with credible messengers in the form of Cure Violence in New York City. And I'm only acknowledging them because they're advocates and specialists in response when it comes particularly to gun violence. Right. Now, that model is a specific thing. The model is very specific. When we think about response to mental illness, and Estelle mentioned earlier, Janet, everyone's mentioned it already. We all know law enforcement, that's not their training. I don't care what type of additional training they get or the course they take or anything of that nature. They have one job to do. The majority of folks might have an interaction with law enforcement after 911 is called. So that tells me they're an agency that's responsive, not preventative. So when we think about mental illnesses of any sort, a lot of times that interaction with law enforcement causes more harm to the person dealing with a crisis or anything within that moment. Because again, the aggressiveness that we see law enforcement have and approach or respond to issues, it's not set up, or they're not utilizing any type of empathetic training or anything to kind of de-escalate it. They're not. Sometimes they might look at as a person that might be a little loud in the moment of their crisis, or they might interpret it as them being a bit irate. But all that's doing is antagonizing the person that's dealing with the illness. So a lot of times, you know, it is heart-wrenching to me too when we have some professionals at times and in certain spaces that want to juggle the thought of having law enforcement as a response model. That really does bother me. And again, I know we've probably heard these terms. I'm sure almost everyone on this call has said it at one time or another. I'm not going to call a plumber when I have a problem with my heart. I'm just not. They're not trained to do so, you know? I'm not going to call a pilot to help me build my deck unless he's double talented and knows some architecture work, right? But I think what I'm trying to say is we cannot allow, or we cannot have as a community, folks who are already dealing with a job that's stressful in nature, especially carrying a firearm, to make split decisions and put it in their arms and allowing them to make the assumption of who's dealing with a mental illness or not. And sometimes I feel like that's where the problem starts. Unfortunately, I've worked with so many families. Mr. Vass's family is not the only ones where their loved ones was lost due to a mental illness call. Here in New York City, we talk about Muhammad Ba. His mother, Mrs. Ba, literally called 911 just to do a wellness check because she hasn't heard from her son. He ended up losing his life. So this is an ongoing thing over decades. So I just personally feel like, you know, it has to be other alternatives. You know, even after the George Floyd uprising, we've seen so many folks trying to explore what that looks like in response of defund, in response of divest and invest, taking funds from law enforcement agency to, you know, give mental illness responders a bigger budget to have the manpower to respond to these instances. Right. So it's a lot going on there, but I'm just a firm believer, and this is not law enforcement's role in the community whatsoever. I know community members that do a better job at just talking to their neighbors and walking them home if need be. But again, in the case of Saheed Vassell, and this last point I'll make here, and I'm really sorry if a lot of things I'm saying is egregious, but I need folks to understand that we're in the meeting today having this conversation. Saheed Vassell is not having this conversation with us today to talk about the services he needs to address his own mental illnesses. That is a problem for me. But I want to point out, when Saheed was murdered, and Pops, please forgive me for doing this, but I need folks to understand this. When law enforcement responded to the 911 calls and they converged on Saheed on the corner of Montgomery and Utica Avenue, they jumped out of their car, unmarked cars at that. None of them were in uniform. They were all plain clothes. And within 2 seconds, I need folks 2 seconds, they opened fire on this young man. They did not announce themselves. They did not talk to him. They did not try to de-escalate whatever they thought was happening. A barrage of bullets killed this young man. And I also want to add to this recklessness, on the corner of Montgomery and Utica was a supermarket where we watched the investigation teams pull bullets out of the wall of a supermarket. It could have been numerous other folks who lost their lives that day, addition from Saheed, because of the recklessness. So I need folks to understand, and I paint that picture because we talk about law enforcement responding to mental illness when that's not their role. Jalen?
Victor,
Let
I
me
feel like
also add, just in case people think this is an exception, same thing happened in Philadelphia. A young man called, his family called, said he needs mental health treatment. They send the police, and within minutes, he's dead. He had a gun. He had a knife. He could not have hurt them. They weren't close enough, but they didn't give him any space. They immediately fired on him. These are not exceptions. This is happening to our community. Our young Black men, particularly, but it's beginning to happen to young Black women too. The police are called. They are fearful. And their first response is to pull a gun out. They don't wait. They don't talk. They just respond. I think in a world that we wish, the world that in some ways Olmstead predicted would give us professionals that would respond to a 911 call, a mental health professional, not a police person who was trained in 10 sessions over a period of time, but a true professional would respond. And that person would be able to take the time they need to be able to talk with the person, to talk with the family, to find a way to support the individual, to determine what the next step is. And sometimes that next step is going back in the house. Sometimes that next step may be transport to a hospital in an ambulance, not a police car. But we have to begin to see other alternatives. And the police cannot and should not be the first.
Jalen, were you going to add something?
Yeah, I think all the other panelists said it very well. The only other point I would add is just that it's never made sense to me that police respond to these situations, especially in our Black community, because a lot of time they are the source of trauma and suffering in our communities. So on site, there's already a distrust, and on site, there's already a fear. And I feel like in my personal experience, as soon as I saw that uniform, I thought, oh, that's it. This is over for me. This is the end. And I'm very fortunate to be here, but like my fellow panelists said, Saheed is not. And I'm just one lucky case. There's many cases of Black women and Black men who aren't that fortunate. And the only other nuance that I can really add is removing police and having these alternative responses. It prevents it from being weaponized against us in the future. As a young woman in the collegiate experience, a little bit personal, but I was dating a gentleman and I was no longer interested in dating him anymore. So I, let him know politely, like, I'm no longer interested. He decided to report me to the Lifeline hotline, which connected to 911, that sent the police to my door. I was almost incarcerated for breaking up with a gentleman. So I'm just trying to add that, like, there's these extreme cases, but it's also like us as Black women, we're also, this can lead to other ways that our lives and our livelihood can be threatened. So all I can say is the other panelists said it well, and there's no reason for us to continuously go through these cycles of trauma when there's so many incredible alternatives that exist. And to Victor's point, it is a legitimate ask for there to be investment in these alternatives rather than giving more money and more training to the police when there's literal racist studies trying to talk about how our skin texture is thicker, how Black women are tougher, things like just very eugenic like studies that are being put out there. It's not appropriate to continue to pour money into a system that harms us whether we have a mental health disability or not. And yeah, I see in the chat how we don't feel pain. Exactly. We do feel pain. We are vulnerable. We're human beings, as some people said in the chat earlier. So I think it's just such an important thing to emphasize as much as we can.
Thanks so much,
Victor. Go. Would you mind me just addressing something in the chat, really, like just briefly?
Please.
Thank you for everyone also having conversation in the chat. I'm trying my best to keep up. Carol asks, has the police been held responsible? Unfortunately, they have not. Right now, we are still advocating with the Bazalon family and trying to fight and utilizing the Attorney General's office to make sure that these officers do get indicted or anything comes forth from that. But also, how do we help families who still call police, right? I mentioned earlier that I work with the crisis management system, which is a cure violence model. It's a base where, we have credible messengers, young men and women from the communities that give back to the communities, right? And I say this so much, obviously we all know the times have changed. Estelle, forgive me, but I'm looking at you as I'm thinking about this thought, because every time I see elders, I want to give an elder a hug, because I remember growing up and walking from my home to the train station on my way to school or to the store to get candy and chips. And all the elders would say, hey, Victor, what you doing? Stay out of trouble. You're not doing this. So we always had a sense of community, so to speak. And then comparing that to now and meeting the Vassal family and having all those community members come back to tell us all these stories and instances of engagement with Saeed. We need to educate our own communities on what resources are readily available. But we also, as a community, need to stand together it's not only about police accountability, it's about government services accountability as well. And the lack of their response and engagement with families that are in need of these services and care. So sometimes my sister actually is on this call too, Tanisha Grant, who runs PSP, Parents Supporting Parents. And I bring her up specifically because no one has the answer yet. But I think as different communities experience different harms, we identify what those specific communities need when it comes to services. My sister Tanisha, literally during the pandemic, as we all know, a lot of schools was going remote. And I'm only saying this to put more context to how we address needs that we see within our communities. Tanisha started a laptop foundation to where what she did was she bridged the gap with education and I don't know what's the term I'm looking for, in technology, right? To say that, no, we're not going to allow our Black and brown kids to not be in school because of the pandemic and not learn. So they're going to have access by way of these laptops to make sure that they can do remote schooling. That's addressing a community need. So when we talk about alternatives to policing, how do we as a community, again, uplift the resources that we have within ourselves, within our own community, to get away from 911? Everyone says alternatives to 911. I don't think it's an alternative. They're just not the ones to call. It shouldn't be, oh, maybe I'll call the police, because we know now, if your cat is stuck in a tree and you dial 911, it's not just the fire department coming with the ladders. The police might get there first and then say the fire department should come. So I'm just trying to, and again, I don't have the answer. I'm just trying to use some life experiences to showcase it. If I stubbed my toe and I called for the ambulance, unfortunately, the police is coming with the ambulance. So I try to get away. I feel like words matter. And when I think of alternatives, I don't think of an and or. Because unfortunately, the thought of an alternative has cost a lot of folks their lives. I'm saying police should not have access to dealing with any type of mental illness or mental crisis in any form or manner.
Thanks so much, Victor. Jalen, Estelle, Victor, Mr. Vassal, I don't know how many of you want to answer this one, but we, in the report, we've talked about what needs to not happen, and that's law enforcement responses. Thoughts about services like supported housing, supported employment, peer support services. Jalen, you mentioned those before. Why are these services an important part of preventing a police response to people in crisis or with mental illness, and how can they be delivered so they're effective for Black communities? Estelle, do you want to go first?
Sure. The one, there are so many things that Olmstead did, but one of the ones I think many of us latched onto right away was affordable, safe, accessible housing. Because housing was one of the reasons that we often said that people needed to be in an institution because they had nowhere else to live. And making housing available and having accessible housing and having people not being placed in institutions was so important. But there's still more steps to make on this. We still don't have enough housing. We still have too many people who are in institutions, including nursing facilities, that have the right to make their choices and live in the communities with supports. My constant argument is people with severe mental illness, people with severe developmental disabilities can live in the communities like everyday people when they have those supports. And those supports can be phased to the cycles of their illness. I do believe we can do this. I've seen it work, and it can work on a larger and larger scale. One of my sayings is our case management system, which should be heavily reliant on peer supports, should be people who travel with you, not travel agents that tell you where to go. They should be people who are there when you need them, not just when you're in crisis. They should be around, available, and accessible to help people. Sometimes they maybe need to be there every day. Sometimes they need to be there less often. We should also have accessible employment for people who want to work. There are ways that they should be able to work, again, with supports. For people of retirement age, and Victor, I do have to stop and say long enough, when I was growing up, when I was walking from home to school, if I didn't say hello to the elders, my parents knew before I got home that I didn't nod my head and say hello. Elders help raise us in a community. So I'm now an elder. I think that's my role too. But we need to reach out and help people be part of our communities. And peer supports are ways to get there. And incidentally, I believe in paid peer supports. I believe they should have a livable and working wage, just like our professionals, and have things to do in the community. And people should have things that they want to do in the community. They should have socialization activities. We should make sure that people aren't isolated. One of the special stories about Saheed is that he was a person seen in the community. He helped out. He volunteered. He was there. He was present. People knew he wasn't homeless because they saw him and they participated with him. All of our people who have a diagnosis of mental illness can have communities of support if we just become more aware. If we recognize that mental illness is an illness, it's not bad behavior.
Yes, when my son took sick, I did not understand how to deal with it. But after his death, I realized how to deal with it. I have seen where the city neglect my son, and I see where the city is now neglecting other people with mental issues. And that's why my heart is at a place where I would love to see every single young man and woman who is going through mental crisis at this time walk in the street, as that the city should find them, have a home for them, take care of them like how you take care of your own children. Because these men and women, young boys and girls, they are a child of someone. And you must share love with them, have a home for them, take them to the movie, teach them trade, bring them back into society. Because the tablet, it did not work on my son. What worked on my son was just to talk to him, give him love, even sometimes pretend. If he say the light is blue, you pretend that the light is blue, to bring him back into, a world that was there for him. So I personally will fight to see that everyone that is going through mental crisis being helped, and the city must step up and put the resource into the community to help people with mental issue, because a person with mental issue is a danger to themselves and also a danger to society. And if we don't help them, they're going to fall along the wayside, and then the family of them suffered, and it will be like a chain reaction. And it's time for something to take place.
I'm going to start turning to questions that have come up in the chat. Thank you so much, Mr. Vassal. One of the questions was that the co-respondal models are getting a much larger share of attention than alternative to response, than responses that do not involve police. How do we shift this attention and focus? Estelle, I don't know if you want to start with that, or Louis, if you want to start there.
I will just start a little bit. One of the reasons, because people call 911, the police are going to respond. If you call 911 because you have a heart attack, the fire department may come in, or EMS, but the police come also. And the police, in the cases of those, they allow the paramedics to take the lead. When they respond with a mental health person, the police take the lead. Part of what we need to do, if we're going to use 911, and I'm not sure 911 is our best bet, but with the system we have now, we need the police to back off and let the mental health professional take the lead. If you have a heart attack, the police aren't the ones that come in and start resuscitating you. They let the paramedics do that. When the police, if they're going to come in on a co-responding model, they need to let the mental health professional clearly take the lead, and they need to stand back and let that happen. If any training the police need, it's to have more confidence in the mental health professionals that they're working with. They need some training on what their role is, which is to stand back and let the mental health professional clearly take the lead until that person indicates that they can't do it. And my guess is that would be very, very rare. But at this point in time, as we begin to look at new systems, it'd be nice to reach a system where 911 with the police is not our first alternative. But if it is, let's make sure that the mental health professional takes the lead and the police back off.
Louis, do you want to share Bazalon's position and how to shift the focus to make sure that law enforcement do not respond?
Sure thing. And hi, everyone. I wasn't expecting to join our panel today, but I'm responding because Amber had a question in the chat I really wanted to respond to. And it was about how, as advocates, what position we take and why is it important to take that position. At Bazalon, our position has been that we should reduce police involvement in these calls to as close as zero as possible. Our mantra should be that we're looking for the least police involved response. This is not a controversial position. And in fact, when you talk with law enforcement officers themselves, they know that that these calls should be handled by people with expertise, including lived experience, who have training developed over years of lived experience or educational attainment at working on de-escalation and stabilizing folks and helping link them to the longer term services and supports and housing that Estelle was talking about. I just think it's incumbent upon us as mental health advocates to insist that this be the least police involved response. That, as Estelle just said, behavioral health should take the lead in responding to calls for help from people involved having mental health or behavioral health issues. If they, communities should make it clear that there is an alternative to calling 911, and as that may be 988 as of Saturday. It may also be community-based, peer-led hotlines and warm lines of the type that Jalen was referring to earlier. And communities need to reform their 911 systems so that a call to 911 does not automatically mean a police response, including the typical co-responder response when the police comes to the scene first, along with a clinician or a mental health professional. Calls to 911 need to be triaged so that they are directed to people with behavioral health expertise, either people co-located in the 911 call center itself, or that the call goes somewhere else where behavioral health experts, including people with lived experience, can respond appropriately. They should be the first persons to the scene when there is a need for someone to go to help someone. If police need to be a backup, that's, as Estelle just said, they can be a backup, but they shouldn't be taking the lead. And I think that it's not a controversial position, and it's where we should be as mental health advocates. Happy to hear from folks in the chat about that. Happy to talk offline with folks about that. But I think that's where Bazalon is, both that's where we've evolved to, including in our paper with the Legal Defense Fund. Jalen, I don't know if there's anything you would add to that on behalf of Bazalon.
I think that was great, Louis. And the only overall thing I would add is I really appreciate how Bazalon does that deep dig. I know we're talking about removing police response for mental health crisis, but I can't help but emphasize enough that we need community-based peer-led response front and center in these situations, because quite frankly, even if the emergency room or the emergency, like if I'm put in ER, there's a metal door in a lot of cases when we are put into behavioral emergency room settings. That is restrictive. A lot of us with lived experiences are not allowed to leave, whether it's an ER that, or an ambulance that responds to us, whether it's from the ER, whether it's the police. A lot of times we're also put in involuntarily in hospitals as well. In a jail, you're not allowed to leave whenever you want to leave, right? I wasn't allowed to leave when I wanted to go home with my mom and dad. So I'm just saying we need to also expand our understanding of what incarceral systems are And I mean, the only other thing I would add, because Lewis put it so well, is I know people identify differently. Even though I do struggle with mental health, I identify with the disability community. And I think that's what Olmstead Promise centers on. I don't identify as having an illness. And I think that's important for a lot of people to understand. I cannot rip my skin off. I'm a Black person. Living with a mental health disability, all that means for me is I navigate my emotions and my thought processes differently. Just because I navigate the world differently than you doesn't mean I'm less than or need to be called a patient or need to be treated as an infant or put in any of these institutions. So I just think, in addition to removing police, we need to look at all these systems and how they are tied to the root of incarceration, which the history of jails do have an intricate tie to mental health asylums. I don't think we should forget that either. But just to emphasize again and again that community-based and peer-led responses should be the center. Adding a peer along with co-responders cannot be the end-all be-all answer.
Jay, oh, sorry, Panika.
No, go for it, Victor. You go first.
Lewis and Jalen, I mean, all the panelists, again, amazing. And you guys bring us so much up because, again, myself, I don't feel like it's a mental illness, but I suffer from ADHD. There's no comparison, right? But I also understand, like, seriously, I'm a grown-ass man. Excuse my language. We're recording.
Be free, okay?
But seriously, anyone who knows me or worked directly with me understands I have to do 10 things at one time or I can't function. That's me. And I've learned to cope with it. Honestly, as an adult, I've learned to cope with it. But I also know sometimes I could be a bit much. Right? But I think too, that comes through having the access. That comes through a support system. My support system is my community. You know, folks ask me all the time, when do you sleep? I can't. And I know all the self-care folks on the call is cringing as I'm speaking, but these are things too that folks help me process, right? And I think as a community that peer services, it's a lot. Mr. Vasu's family suffering this traumatic experience, my family suffering this traumatic experience. I don't do well with seeing police, but I know how to deal with it, you know, and you can't see on the screen. I'm a big guy. I'm a big Black guy. Everyone in my family always says, make sure you get home. But that wasn't the highlight of why I came up from you. What I wanted to also explain is when we think about this partnership, so to speak, with agencies, why it doesn't work. I was recently in Buffalo, can't speak specifically, directly about this was ongoing, but I was recently in Buffalo and doing some response to the Buffalo mass shooting. We met with some locals there. I'll be very quick on this. We met with some locals there. They needed assistance because a young community member, young man, 24 years old, supervisor at Amazon, he was going through a crisis. He was talking to his brother at 2:30 in the morning. He didn't feel he was getting enough just talking to his family. He asked his brother to go with him to the local hospital so he can speak to a specialist. True story. He goes to the specialist, and I only find out about it because when he goes to the specialist, the hospital admitted him. And the hospital said he can't get out until he speaks to the therapist, and the therapist clears him. This was on a Friday. Their therapist wasn't coming back in until Sunday. But then they had a clause to say that they can hold them in the facility for up to 72 hours unless they level him up or something of some sort like that. I only knew about it because while we were on the ground, folks reached out to us. The family said, no, we need to get him out. He's going to lose his job if he doesn't show up. We go to the hospital. We literally stood there for 2.5 hours arguing with folks about why is he admitted against his will. Now, I will say we don't know what the conversation was when he went there, why they thought to admit him. I have no clue. But what I'm saying to you is, you know how bad of a deterrent that is for Black men who want to explore their own emotions in a healthy manner, but then feel like you're being held hostage. It's a deterrent. For me, dealing with my ADHD, I thank God that I had a support system that helped me work through it, like Vasu's family did with Saheed, where I did not have to go that route to be put into a facility. But what I'm saying to you is the peer-to-peer, that peer-to-peer, when I say credible messengers, that's peer-to-peer. And the last thing I say on this is in Brooklyn, Brownsville, New York, over the last year and a half, they've been running what they call safety alliances, pilot programs. Anybody can Google it. It's called, we called it BSA. They were Brownsville Safety Alliances. This was a partnership, and I'm telling you guys this for a reason, because all my opinions are very unbiased. This was a partnership between law enforcement and local community stakeholders. The stakeholders were local businesses, community members who live in the neighborhood, and other advocates. And law enforcement allowed the credible messaging group there by the name of Bevo, Brownsville and Violence Out, to field 911 calls. It's a pilot program. What did that mean? That meant that as a 911 came in, 911 call came in, depending on what type of call it was, they would allow the violence interrupters to go out and respond to domestic violence calls. Because why? They're familiar faces within the community. They're trusted within the community, and they have the training to deal with a domestic violence thing. They've done this pilot program 4 times. They all lasted over a span of a weekend, progressed to a span of a week. But what I'm saying to folks is there are folks trying it. But even though this pilot program was working, community members did say, guess what? We need to sever ties with law enforcement, because everyone won't buy in, knowing that this program is contingent on law enforcement's engagement and the allowance of getting 911 call information. So I just wanted to put that out there. So for folks are thinking of the peer piece, it can be done, but you need community to support community. You need those trusted, validated faces to break down those barriers. We really need to work together and rebuild our communities to take care of our loved ones within the community.
Go ahead, Mr. Bethel.
Police should be the last resort when it comes to people with mental illness. And another thing that I learned when Said was in the hospital, he refers to the hospital as a prison. And in there, he's more traumatized in the hospital than when he's on the outside. And he always complained about the tablets that he was to take, because it said that it do me no good. It's only sick my stomach, it's let me throw up, let me sleep. You know, it just keep him calm for a period of time, and he hate to be in there. So many times when he was there, I had to talk to the doctor when they don't want to send him out and tell him, I will be responsible for him. So many times I had to sign him out because he told me that he's getting crazy being in there. Just the restriction and the tablets that he was taking that was not well with his system. So we need homes for these people where they can interact with the community, where they can interact with people than to, held like they held behind their own choices. So police should be the last resort, and lock them up into an institute and giving them tablets. I don't see that the way that they should be treated.
Thank you so much, Mr. Vassell. And one of the questions we had in the chat, and I'll make this the last question to our folks in this conversation and then hand it to Louis to close us out. But the question was, how can providers make accessing services like peer support, counseling, community support, culturally responsive to people of color? If the providers are white, or is the answer to diversify providers or anything else? How can services be made culturally responsive for people of color?
Well, the first probably obvious answer is hiring people of color. And if you have people of color who are using your services, find out whether they'd be interested in becoming peer specialists. There are all sorts of training for peer specialists. Reach out to professionals in social work or psychiatry to try to make sure they understand you have job openings. Seek people out, look for them. One of the programs we have here in Pennsylvania is we try to work with the medical schools around selecting psychiatrists of color and then having them work in the public system and trying to give them the opportunities to work with people with lived experience. And to try to get people in lived experience, not only as peer specialists, but helping those that want to continue their education. There are so many opportunities to bring in people of color in different jobs, give them different opportunities. They're there. If that's your clientele, then you have the way to make it culturally diversity. You just have to take that opportunity. Let me say as my very last comment is Lewis's comments about advocacy. We all need to read his comment and take it so seriously. We change our culture, we change our activities through advocacy. We need to become strong, vocal, and persistent advocates.
Paneet, I'm sorry. I just want to address one thing. I'm not trying to single you out, but Grace, thank you for your comment as well. I know Grace just wrote in the chat, if you try to leave involuntary admission, they will file for involuntary. Yes, the same Buffalo incident I just mentioned, what happened that day was the young man could have voluntarily signed himself out. The issue with that is, and again, people don't know these systems until we have to go through it. If he would have voluntarily signed himself out, his insurance would have been voided for that hospital visit, and he would have had to pay for that visit out of pocket, which he could have done. But then we actually were going to just pay for him to get out. Then we heard that even if we do that, the hospital, the doctors, whoever, can still make the determination that he needs to stay in. So he could have signed himself out, paid money, which he wouldn't have got a refund on, and still would have had the hospital dictate whether he needs to stay in or stay out. So I think, Grace, that's a great point. But again, it's that behind the scenes type of stuff that we don't see all the time because we're just trying to get the services that folks have to deal with in the end. And these are the problems with these systems that we have to fix.
Thanks, Victor. And I want to apologize if there have been missteps on language, on any aspect of language and vocabulary in this conversation. We really appreciate everyone coming to the table and sharing and being honest about identities and language that is important to each of us. We do our best to both center Black communities, but also I'm just trying to get through questions quickly, and I apologize if I made any missteps, but really appreciate all of the panelists, everyone who's participated in the conversation, Mr. Vassal, Victor, Jalen, Estelle, and everyone who's participated in the chat and joined us today to listen to these inspiring advocates. Thank you all, and I'm going to turn it over to Lewis to close us out.
Yeah, I just have to repeat Puneet's thanks to everyone who joined us today. We're really so grateful that you took some time out of your day to be with us to discuss these critical issues. Again, I want to thank all of our incredibly inspiring speakers. I'm also super grateful on behalf of Bazalon Center to be able to work with Puneet, Lisa, Sarah, all the folks from the Legal Defense Fund team. We're just very grateful to be able to lift up these issues with you. Please, in the spirit of continued advocacy, please be on the lookout for follow-up toolkit materials from the Legal Defense Fund and the Bazalon Center, including videos from today's events, action steps for federal, state, and local advocates, and much more. I would also be remiss at the very end if I didn't say that the Bazalon Center is turning 50 this year. So please feel free to get in touch with us for information about our 50th anniversary event at 5 p.m. Eastern, Thursday, September 22nd. Thanks again to everybody. Have a great day. Thank you.